It is 9 o'clock in the morning on December 19th, 1944, and inside a cold stone barracks in Verdun, a French town that already carries the ghosts of one world war, a group of American generals stand around a table covered in acetate and pencil marks. Snow is falling outside. A single stove struggles to warm the room, and most of the men keep their greatcoats buttoned to the collar. On the easels behind them sit the situation maps prepared by General Kenneth Strong, the British officer serving as Eisenhower's chief of intelligence, showing a red gash torn through the American front in the Ardennes. 4 days earlier, few of the officers in this room believed the German army capable of mounting a major offensive at all. Now, 250,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks are pouring through the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, and a vital road junction called Bastogne is about to be surrounded. Dwight Eisenhower turns to George Patton and asks a single question. How long would it take the Third Army to break off its own attack, pivot 90 degrees, and drive north to relieve Bastogne? Patton does not hesitate. 2 divisions, he says, within 48 hours. The room falls quiet. Omar Bradley, ever cautious, assumes it cannot be done and offers 72 hours instead, and even that strikes the assembled staff as close to impossible in the depths of a European winter, on icy roads with no air cover. What none of them fully grasp yet is that Patton is not improvising. Sitting in a folder back at Third Army headquarters in Nancy is a set of contingency plans already drawn up, already war-gamed, already waiting. The foundation of that plan is a piece of paper that history has largely overlooked in favor of the tanks and the generals. A map, built from painstaking intelligence work that predicted this German attack a full week before it happened. When German commanders eventually learned how quickly and how completely the Americans responded, several would describe the maneuver as something they had believed no army could execute in winter. This is the story of that map, the men who built it, and the 72 hours that followed. Maps, in most retellings of the Second World War, are treated as scenery. They hang behind the generals in newsreel footage, colored arrows sweeping across them to show where armies moved and when. What they rarely show is the far slower, far less cinematic process that produced them. The daily grind of collating prisoner statements, aerial photographs, radio intercepts, and captured documents into a single coherent picture of what the enemy might do next, not merely where he happened to be standing. A situation map updated carelessly could cost thousands of lives. A situation map updated with genuine imagination, built by an officer prepared to draw an unpopular conclusion and defend it to a demanding commander, could alter the course of a battle before the first shot was fired. That is precisely what happened in Nancy, in the second week of December 1944, in an unremarkable headquarters building that history has largely allowed the tanks to overshadow. By December 1944, the war in the West had settled, in the minds of most Allied commanders, into a matter of time rather than doubt. Paris had fallen in August. American and British spearheads had crossed into Germany itself in September. Bradley's staff spoke of Germany as a beaten enemy, a regime running on fumes, and Eisenhower's own intelligence summaries in the weeks before the attack described the Wehrmacht's capacity for offensive action as negligible. The Ardennes sector, 85 miles of dense, snow-choked forest with a road network so thin that armies had traditionally avoided it, was treated as a place to rest exhausted divisions and blood-green replacements rather than a front line to defend in depth. 4 divisions, some worn down by the fighting in the Hurtgen forest, others newly arrived from the United States and yet to fire a shot in anger, held a line that in a more active sector would have needed 3 or 4 times the manpower. The problem was not a lack of raw information. Aerial reconnaissance, signals intercepts, and prisoner interrogations had all produced fragments suggesting a German buildup east of the line. The difficulty was interpretation. Across Allied headquarters, that same fragmentary evidence was being explained away. Surely, the reasoning went, Hitler had nothing left to attack with. Surely those reserves and refitted panzer divisions gathering in the forests of the Eifel were being held back to counter the next Allied push into Germany, not massed for an offensive of their own. It was, as more than one post-war historian would later put it, not so much a failure to collect intelligence as a failure of imagination, a refusal to believe that a nearly beaten enemy might still have one desperate throw of the dice left in him. Whole armies were about to pay for that assumption in the opening days of the battle, when total surprise handed the Germans 50 miles of ground and encircled thousands of American troops before most Allied commanders had even accepted that a major offensive was underway. The scale of the miscalculation is worth dwelling on, because it makes the exception all the more striking. Some 600 miles of front stretched between the North Sea and Switzerland by mid-December, held by 48 Allied divisions, and the overwhelming weight of intelligence attention was fixed eastward, on where the next Allied push into Germany itself might be launched, not on where a defeated enemy might strike back. Weather, too, played its part in the deception, since thick cloud and fog grounded the aircraft that would ordinarily have spotted a buildup of this size, and the Germans deliberately moved their reserves at night to compound the problem. Even a captured German order confirming that a major offensive was underway, seized by American troops on the very first afternoon of the attack, was initially waved away by staff officers unwilling to accept that the war's final act might not yet have arrived. Against that backdrop of near-universal complacency, one small intelligence section behaved as though the unthinkable might, in fact, be entirely thinkable. One command chose not to share that assumption. At 3rd Army Headquarters in Nancy, the intelligence section, known in Army shorthand as G2, was run by a soft-spoken colonel named Oscar Koch. Koch had built a reputation within Patton's staff as a man who treated every scrap of intelligence, however small, as a piece of a larger picture rather than an isolated curiosity. Through the last weeks of November, his section had been logging a steady accumulation of detail. Reports of fresh divisions being fed into the German order of battle opposite the thinly held American 8th Corps, prisoners describing English-speaking soldiers being pulled aside and sent for special training, unusual rail and road traffic behind the German lines that made no sense if the enemy's reserves were purely defensive. On December 9th, a full week before the German guns opened fire, Koch presented his conclusions to Patton directly. The Germans, he argued, were assembling for a major counteroffensive, and the most likely point of attack was precisely the quiet, thinly defended Ardennes sector that neighboring headquarters had all but written off as a rest area. What Koch produced was not a single dramatic document but a composite intelligence picture, built layer upon layer onto the standard G2 situation map, the kind of working chart that every headquarters kept updated with colored pins, unit symbols, and estimated enemy strengths. On Koch's map, unlike those hanging in neighboring headquarters, the German reserve divisions were not treated as a passive backdrop. They were plotted as a coiled, mobile threat with the road network available to them and travel times calculated in hours, not days. It was the difference between a map that recorded where the enemy happened to be and one that asked, urgently, what the enemy could do next with what they had. Patton, convinced by the analysis, quietly ordered his own staff to begin drafting 3 alternative attack plans, each assuming a different axis for a possible relief operation should the Germans strike in the Ardennes. It was a piece of foresight that violated no orders and drew no attention, because on paper, 3rd Army was still fixed on its own eastward offensive towards the Saar. Underneath that routine planning, however, sat the seed of the maneuver that would astonish friend and enemy alike within a fortnight. The map itself, if a modern viewer could stand in that Nancy headquarters and examine it, would look deceptively ordinary, roughly the size of a large dining table, pinned flat and covered in acetate overlay so that grease pencil markings could be wiped clean and redrawn as fresh reports arrived through the day. Colored symbols denoted divisions, red for the enemy and blue for friendly forces, with unit strengths, supply states, and estimated readiness scrawled alongside in a shorthand that only trained G2 staff could read at a glance. What made Koch's version unusual was not the symbols themselves, but the questions his section asked of them. Where a conventional situation map might record a panzer division as stationary, resting 20 miles behind the line, Koch's staff annotated it with the roads available to it, the fuel and rail capacity feeding it, and the number of hours it would need to reach any given point on the American front. It converted a static snapshot into something closer to a forecast, and it was that forecast, more than any single captured document, that persuaded Patton to gamble staff hours on plans for a battle that, officially, was not supposed to be coming. The attack came at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, opening with a 90-minute artillery bombardment along the whole of the Ardennes front before German infantry and armor surged forward into the fog. For the first 2 days, confusion reigned at nearly every level of the Allied command structure. First, Army headquarters, holding a captured copy of a German order confirming a major offensive was underway, still could not bring itself to accept the scale of what was happening. It was not until the evening of December 16th, when Kenneth Strong's deputy burst into a Scheif meeting with fragmentary but unmistakable reports of powerful attacks against the weakest sector of the line, that the full picture began to register at the very top of the Allied command. Patton, by contrast, had already alerted his staff. When the summons to Verdun arrived, his contingency plans were not theoretical exercises gathering dust. They were live documents, refined and ready, built on the same intelligence foundation Koch had assembled a week earlier. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. What followed has since become one of the most studied logistical feats of the entire war. Roughly 133,000 vehicles, along with 3 full divisions, were redirected from an eastward axis onto icy secondary roads running north in the depths of winter, without the benefit of the air cover that had supported every previous American offensive. Convoys drove through the night with headlights taped to slits. Engineers cleared and repaired roads as columns advanced, and staff officers who had spent the war learning the plodding rhythms of set-piece attacks were asked to improvise an entire army's redeployment in under 3 days. Patton telephoned a single coded instruction, "Play ball," and the machinery he and Koch had quietly prepared for a week began to move. Elements of the 4th Armored Division reached the outskirts of Bastogne on December 26th, opening a narrow corridor to the besieged defenders of the 101st Airborne Division, who had already refused a German surrender ultimatum 4 days earlier with a single word of reply that needed no elaboration. German commanders, for their part, had built their entire operational timetable on the assumption that no Allied army could respond to a major breakthrough for at least a week, perhaps longer, given the state of the roads and the customary caution of Allied planning. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army and one of the more capable German field commanders of the war, had calculated his advance towards the Meuse around exactly that kind of delay. The sight of an entire American army disengaging from one offensive and striking hard from an entirely different direction within 72 hours did not fit any operational model German staff officers had drawn up. Prisoners taken during the relief of Bastogne reported that their own commanders had been told an American counterattack of that scale and speed was simply not achievable in winter conditions. A judgment that, once proven wrong, forced a hurried and costly reshuffling of German reserves to meet a threat their planning had assumed away entirely. The comparison with the northern shoulder of the battle is instructive, and not to Field Marshal Montgomery's credit in terms of speed, whatever the wisdom of his caution. Given command of the American 1st and 9th Armies to stabilize the northern flank, Montgomery approached the crisis with characteristic deliberation, consolidating his lines and preparing a more methodical counterattack that would take the better part of a month to fully develop, compared with the 3 days Patton needed to reach Bastogne from the south. This is not, in itself, an indictment of Montgomery, whose caution reflected a defensible reading of a fluid and dangerous situation on a wider front, and whose own forces would play their part in eventually sealing the northern side of the bulge. But the contrast illustrates precisely what made the American effort in the South so remarkable to friend and enemy alike. Intelligence work that had begun a week before a shot was fired had been converted, through prepared contingency planning, into an operational tempo that no army on either side believed possible. German intelligence estimates of Allied capability, by contrast, had assumed a lumbering, methodical opponent throughout, an assumption that the entire Ardennes gamble had been built upon, and that Koch's map, indirectly, had already begun to unpick before the offensive even began. None of this should obscure the enormous cost of the fighting itself, which this account, focused as it is on maps and headquarters, cannot properly convey. The soldiers of the 4th Armored Division who finally reached the perimeter at Bastogne on the afternoon of December 26th had spent 4 days grinding through determined German resistance south of the town, in temperatures that dropped low enough to cause frostbite casualties by the thousand across the wider battle, on roads so treacherous the tank columns sometimes advanced no faster than a walking pace. The men, trapped inside the perimeter, had endured a week of encirclement with dwindling ammunition and no winter clothing to speak of, kept alive in part by a break in the weather on December 23rd that finally allowed transport aircraft to drop supplies by parachute. Whatever credit belongs to a colonel's map and a general's telephone call, it was infantrymen and tank crews, not staff officers, who paid the price of turning intelligence into ground held. The material impact of the relief of Bastogne is well documented and beyond serious dispute. The siege was broken, the 101st Airborne and the scattered units defending the town were resupplied and reinforced, and the southern shoulder of the German salient was permanently blunted, denying Hitler's forces the road network they needed to press on towards the Meuse and, eventually, Antwerp. The psychological impact is harder to measure with precision, resting as it does on prisoner interrogation reports and post-war German accounts that vary in detail and reliability, and any documentary maker owes it to the record to say so plainly. What can be stated with confidence is that German operational planning at every level above the battalion had assumed Allied slowness as a fixed constant of the campaign, and that the speed of Third Army's response removed that assumption within a week of the offensive's launch, at a point when German reserves were already stretched thin and fuel supplies critically short. The wider Ardennes offensive would grind on into January 1945, but the failure to take Bastogne on schedule and the unraveling of German timetables that followed is treated by most military historians as one of the decisive turning points of the battle. Oskar Koch received comparatively little public recognition during his lifetime, working for decades in the long shadow of the generals whose reputations his intelligence work had quietly protected. He would later write his own account of the campaign, arguing that the popular story of a total Allied intelligence failure at the Bulge obscured a more uncomfortable truth. The same raw intelligence had been available across Allied headquarters, and the difference between disaster and readiness at Third Army lay not in secret sources but in the discipline of analysis, in the willingness to draw an unwelcome conclusion from ambiguous evidence and act on it before it was confirmed. He was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame decades after the war, a quiet honor for a quiet man whose situation map never carried the drama of a captured enemy order or a broken cipher, only the unglamorous decisive work of seeing clearly what others preferred not to. Return for a moment to that cold room in Verdun, to the acetate maps on their easels and the generals in their buttoned greatcoats. What separated the officers gathered there was not courage, nor equipment, nor even raw information, since all of it had passed, in one form or another, across every Allied headquarters in the theater. What separated them was a single map, built a week early by a colonel few outside his own headquarters had heard of, and a commander willing to act on its uncomfortable conclusion before anyone demanded that he do so. The Germans built their entire gamble on the belief that no Allied response could be fast enough to matter. They were not wrong about most of the Allied command structure. They were wrong about one army, one intelligence officer, and one map that had already done the work of imagining the attack before it came. 72 hours changed a siege into a relief, a gamble into a rout, and a colonel's careful pencil marks into one of the most consequential pieces of paper of the entire war. The tanks broke through at Bastogne. The map broke through first.